Our last presentation is Endocrine Disruption and Unconventional Oil and Gas. Kim Shultz coordinates the oil and gas program at the nonprofit organization TEDx, the Endocrine Disruption Exchange. She studies the potential health impacts from exposure to chemicals introduced and released during oil and natural gas extraction and production. She has co-authored several studies on endocrine disrupting chemicals associated with drilling, fracking, and air pollution, and maintains a comprehensive online database of peer-reviewed articles on fracking and health. Prior to joining TEDx, Kim studied native plant populations used for restoration of public lands in Colorado and soil fertility in organic farming systems. She graduated right here from CSU with a degree in international agronomy. Won't you please welcome Kim Shultz?
Okay, as he said, I'm Kim Shultz. I am the Oil and Gas Program Coordinator for TEDx, the Endocrine Disruption Exchange. TEDx is a science-based nonprofit research institute, and our mission is to reduce the production and use of chemicals that interfere with healthy hormone function. We were founded in 2003 by Theo Colborn, who is considered a pioneer in the field of endocrine disruption science, And we began working on fracking and health in 2004. Today, I'll give a quick overview of the endocrine system, hormones, and endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs. The majority of my time will be spent familiarizing you with the body of research showing a relationship between EDCs and unconventional oil and gas, which I'm going to shorten to fracking. I just want you to know I mean the whole process and not just chemical injection. I'm focusing on studies showing reproduction and developmental outcomes, including findings from in vitro, animal, and human research. And much of this research is focused on prenatal exposure. We've heard a little bit about that. And I want you to be thinking about how much evidence is enough before we take action to protect health. Okay, I know that almost everyone here is a medical professional, but you might not be familiar with endocrine disruption, but I bet there's something we all are familiar with. Oh, and so I'm asking you to raise your hands if you know anyone with any of these health conditions. Metabolic disorders like diabetes, thyroid disorders, obesity, neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD and autism, infertility, cancer. So when you look around, basically everyone has their hands up. Like we know someone, either our friends or our family or a patient, who has one of these conditions. And there's a couple of things they have in common. First, they were all relatively rare before the modern age of chemicals. And second, they're all moderated, at least in part, by our endocrine system. Our endocrine system is the overarching system that integrates our body's glands and organs, like the pancreas, thyroid, adrenal, sex organs, and now we know even the brain and the heart and body fat, among others. These are all part of the endocrine system, and they all produce hormones or function under hormonal control. Oh, these organs, glands, and tissues communicate with each other by sending hormones like messages through our bloodstream. Hormones regulate how we develop in the womb, how our bodies function, and how we grow and mature. These hormones bind to receptors to deliver messages on how to function. There are 80,000 plus chemicals currently in use in the US right now. And some fraction of these chemicals can affect these same hormone receptors by altering hormone production, metabolism, or movement throughout the body. And industrial sources like fracking are a big contributor to EDCs in our environment. There are three pathways of exposure we heard a little about: inhalation, ingestion, and dermal. And I feel like a lot of attention is given to EDC exposure from consumer products like BPA and plastic water bottles, but we have a little control over our exposure to that. We have less control over EDCs in our environment, in our air and water and soil. We know fracking contributes to local and regional air pollution. We heard all about that, and we know that it can pollute the water and soil through various pathways like leaks and spills and improper wastewater disposal. Hormones function at extremely low concentrations in the parts per billion or parts per trillion range. Try to picture 1 second in 32 years, and you're in the range of parts per billion. Air and water sampling at fracking sites have found EDCs in this range and even up into the parts per million range. And obviously fracking is not the only source of EDCs in our environment, but they do contribute to our total exposure. And while you're directly exposed to EDCs throughout your life, you're also indirectly exposed while in the womb. We know many chemicals can cross the placenta, so in fact, our infants are born pre-polluted. Some effects from prenatal exposure may be more immediate, like altered fetal growth and development. But prenatal exposure can also influence development of diseases and disorders later in life, like we saw in that first slide. Also troubling is that the average concentration of EDCs are typically higher in children than adults. And this is because, as Larissa said, children spend more time closer to the ground where chemicals settle. They have greater hand-to-mouth behavior than adults. They have greater food and water intake per unit body weight, and their immune and metabolic systems are immature, so they don't process chemicals the way that we do. Okay, now you had that primer on EDCs. It's time to move on to why I think they are chemicals of concern for people living near oil and gas operations. I mentioned Theo started this work about 15 years ago. She was approached by a landowner in Garfield County where fracking was taking place in western Colorado for a little bit longer than it has been here on a wide scale. So she was approached by Laura Amos, a resident in Garfield County. In 2001, her water well had exploded. At the same time, Encana was fracking 4 wells 1,000 feet from her home. 2 years later, she was diagnosed with a rare adrenal tumor, and the tumor and her adrenal gland were removed. They discovered that 2-BE was in the fracking fluid mix used in this well. It can cause tumors in the adrenal gland, as well as damage to several organs and the endocrine system. And her daughter, who was breastfeeding, was exposed as well. At the time, industry was saying they used only soap, water, and guar gum for fracking, so how did the 2-BE get in this well? Working with Earthworks Oil and Gas Accountability Project, TEDx was able to collect material safety data sheets for products used and stored on well pads. And in a few years, we had 944 products. From that, we were able to identify 353 chemicals used for drilling and fracking. So part of what I do at TEDx is create databases on the potential health effects from chemical exposures. For these 353 chemicals, we looked at 13 categories, including those with more immediate health effects from acute exposures, things like coughing and wheezing and rashes. And then we also looked for health conditions stemming from chronic exposures that may not show up until later in life, like cancer or impaired reproduction. We also discovered over 100 chemicals could impact the endocrine system. We published this in 2011, and it was part of that really early discussion on chemical disclosure. And we have come a long way since then, but there are still many unknowns surrounding chemicals used and especially released during fracking. In 2010, TEDx was approached by a frustrated landowner in Garfield County again, who had what doctors and residents locally referred to as the Anakov. There are already 130 producing gas wells within a mile of our home, and soon development was going to start on 16 new wells. So we did an exploratory year-long air sampling study at our residence to see what would happen over the course of building these wells out from pad development to production. And we found 61 chemicals, including all these ones we've heard before, like the non-methane hydrocarbons, those light alkanes, and then we found some of the heavier aromatics and some aldehydes, and we did find lots and lots of EDCs. We kind of followed up on that, I guess, with our most recent paper, which just came out this year, though, that identified EDCs found in the air near upstream oil and gas sites across the country. We evaluated 48 studies and found over 200 chemicals and identified 34 EDCs that impact hormone function or hormone-mediated outcomes like impaired fetal development. The study confirmed that EDCs are found in the air at concentrations near oil and gas sites that have been shown to impact our health. So you can see here how the field of study on fracking and health keeps growing. We've seen information from the compendium before, and then we saw the PSE database and all those articles, but these are just health endpoints, health outcome articles. They don't have anything to do with like pathways of exposure or anything. So this is still a lot. This is over 160 articles that have come out in just health. And more than 30 of these studies focus on either identifying EDCs or conditions that might be, at least in part, explained through hormone disruption. And I mentioned I'm splitting, so now I'm going to focus in on that. And I mentioned I'm splitting that group into, that group of literature into three groups: the in vitro, the animal, and the human studies. And I think taken together, this is a good body of evidence that creates quite a compelling story about why we should try to protect those living near oil and gas. Oh, I want to point out that TEDx didn't do this research, so if you have real specific questions on articles, you can go into online where all of our additional resources are, and you can find links to them. And I should say that right at the bottom is the articles that I talk about in the slides, so if you did want to look them up. For several years, a research team led by Dr. Susan Nagel, of which Dr. Chris Casotis is part of it, you might have heard his name more because he's the lead author a lot. They've been looking at hormone activity associated with fracking operations. They've evaluated surface and groundwater in impacted areas, wastewater and fracking chemicals, and found altered hormone concentrations and metabolism in cells. Research is now emerging from other teams that supports this. This in vitro research is important because it establishes that some fracking and wastewater chemicals are endocrine active, and water quality downstream from fracking sites may be impacted. It also helps to drive the research to the next level, exposing animal models to fracking chemicals and wastewater to look for health impacts. The Nagel group then began to look at adverse health outcomes in mice offspring for mothers exposed to a mix of fracking chemicals. And mice are commonly used in the lab as a model for humans. I included this slide for anyone who's interested in their mix of 23 fracking chemicals. Using a mixture rather than individual ingredients better mimics an actual exposure scenario, since we know fracking fluids can contain dozens of chemicals going in the well. The researchers found that offspring had changes in organ weights and function, including reproductive organs, and altered hormone concentrations. Changes to the mammary gland, which is a hormone-sensitive organ, were found in adult females that had been exposed prenatally. Also, immunological changes, including alterations in T cell populations and response to various diseases, were found, especially in the female mice. And similar research using tadpoles exposed to this mixture reinforced that these chemicals are immunotoxicants. This research established that maternal exposure to fracking chemicals can impact developmental outcomes in offspring. Another team out of Dr. Greg Goss's lab at the University of Alberta are looking at zebrafish exposed to flowback and produced water and endocrine-mediated effects in their embryos and offspring. Now, you might be surprised to know that zebrafish actually share 70% of genes with us and have most of the same major organs and tissues, so they're actually used in the lab for a model for humans as well. The effects found ranged from embryo malformations to altered metabolism and gene expression and fitness in the maturing fish. They also did 2 studies looking at wastewater exposure in Daphnia, and Daphnia is a model for ecological health, and the Daphnia had impaired mobility and reproduction. So this research established that exposure to chemicals found in flowback and produced water can impact reproduction and development in human and ecological models. So we come away with a few key findings from this animal research. We see prenatal and early life exposures to fracking chemicals and wastewater are associated with adverse reproductive and developmental outcomes in multiple models. Some of these effects were immediate, and some were not seen until adulthood. This suggests that there may be a connection between prenatal exposure to fracking-related chemicals and the lifelong health of the offspring. The animals were exposed to a range of doses focusing on ingestion as the primary pathway, although dermal exposure is a pathway in fish. And health effects were found at concentrations that have been measured in the environment. Okay, so I've been building to get to this body of epidemiological research. And I'm not an epidemiologist, so I'm keeping this really high level. But I think this slide is really important when evaluating this data set. I'm focusing on the prenatal and infant health studies because they have endocrine-related outcomes, but there are many studies looking at other outcomes, including things like asthma and cardiovascular health, and there's just a lot of different endpoints. It's more challenging to try to summarize these findings than the in vitro and animal research because there's no set method for defining human exposure. Well density, as represented by the number of wells and distance to maternal residence, has been used in several studies as a measure of exposure. Within these studies, various distances from the residence were assessed for significance ranging from less than 1 kilometer to 10 miles. Some studies have incorporated intensity factors, which might include things like well status and phase of the development, so what was going on during gestation. And listed under other variables like shale play and population size and time span. This slide shows research results in these 5 categories. Birth weights, described as low or decreased birth weight in babies that came to term. Small for gestational age, infant mortality, preterm birth, and birth defects, both structural and developmental. The bars represent total number of studies and is shaded so that you can see if a study had a significant association, so evidence of a health effect, they're yellow, or no association, and that's in white. These are all retrospective studies, and that means they are using data from, in this case, birth certificates, medical records, and registries that report outcomes. And finally, not every study included every endpoint. So what jumps out is a lack of consistent findings across the same endpoint, making it very hard to come to firm conclusions. And this is certainly due, in part at least, to that lack of consistency characterizing exposure in study design, which is why I showed you that last slide. Keep in mind, though, 9 out of 10 studies reported that at least one significant association showing fracking can impact infant health. As medical professionals, I know you know more about these things than I do because I was at the PSR room and I learned more about low birth weight than I knew. But they are all predictors of future health. There are endpoints we saw there are many endpoints we saw in animal research that may be more difficult to measure in humans or aren't reported at birth, like altered neurodevelopment. Effects related to these endpoints, like learning disabilities or lower IQ or behavioral problems in children, require following these children as they mature. And this kind of research would need to be done to follow up on some of those findings from the animal studies, to confirm that effects in adults who are prenatally exposed, effects like the impaired immune function and reproduction. But unfortunately, this would mean a much longer study period, leaving yet another generation of people exposed to these harmful emissions. Okay, we've just covered a lot of ground here, so let's sum this up with a slide on what we know. EDCs have been found in drilling and fracking fluids, air emissions, and wastewater, and they've been detected at concentrations that are hormonally active in the environment. Evidence from animal research has shown that prenatal exposure to fracking-related chemicals can impact the health of offspring. These studies support the epidemiological research on developmental outcomes seen in communities impacted by fracking. And all this data is important for determining the risk to public health. So human research related to fracking operations is still in its infancy. Since it's unethical to run experiments on people, we must rely on the supporting body of evidence that I showed you, showing a connection from prenatal exposures to fracking-related chemicals and adverse health effects. Well, my focus is obviously on chemical exposure. No one knows the exact causal relationships behind these outcomes. Generally, the exposure metrics used favor air pollution as a big contributor to decreased infant health. There are certainly some non-chemical stressors, and we heard about some of them at least a little bit, the noise and light pollution and chemical stressors that could be impacting birth outcomes on their own or in combination with chemical exposure. We can't depend on regulators or lawmakers to protect us. As medical professionals, you can provide a tremendous service in protecting patient health by educating your patients and others on the threats environmental pollution can have on our health. Drilling and fracking are very visual and they're very disruptive, and it's easy to think of health impacts during these stages. But remember, after all the equipment's gone and after the trucks are gone, these wells will still be there and they'll still be producing for decades, and they present an ongoing health hazard. So please advocate for better public health protection and reduced exposure to known polluting sources. Thanks. Okay, the question is, what's the likely pathway for EDC exposure for residents near fracking wells? And that would be air. That will be the most immediate pathway that you'll see, and it's something that will be a definite pathway, whereas like water or other things are potential pathways, but not necessarily, but not necessarily the primary one. I didn't do that. Okay, to end on this, it says, since the most effective way of slowing climate change is to slow human population growth, and since many endocrine disruptors decrease fertility, shouldn't we encourage the addition of EDCs to our environment? It says, more seriously, could we consider EDCs as Gaia's revenge? Well, that's the only way to end that on a positive note, so we'll do that.
Well done. Thank you, Kim.